Sign the papers, Adelaide. You're nothing but a ghost in this house. My father's roar still echoed in my skull, clashing with the silent explosion on the 80-inch screen. 1 DNA chart, 2 0% matches, and 30 years of lies detonated in a single blue flash. Mendez wasn't his son, yet they had slaughtered my life to crown a stranger. As the empire turned to ash in that boardroom, I felt the phantom weight of a hand-knitted scarf in my lap, pulling my mind back to the night the storm first broke. The humidity of a Houston evening usually clings to the skin like a damp wool blanket. But tonight, the rain was different. It was sharp, cold, and relentless, drumming against the roof of my car as I sat in the driveway of the Bundy estate. I stared at the towering limestone walls of my childhood home, a place that felt more like a fortress than a sanctuary. The scent of rain on hot asphalt drifted through the vents, mixing with the faint, sweet aroma of the lavender sachet I kept in the glove box. I adjusted my grip on the small gift in my lap, a hand-knitted scarf, soft and cream-colored. I had spent 6 months on it, weaving every stitch with a quiet hope that perhaps this time my mother would see me. Have you ever stood outside a door you've entered 1,000 times and felt like a trespasser? That was the rhythm of my life at 29. I stepped into the foyer, the heavy oak doors groaning as they closed behind me. The air inside was thick with the smell of expensive mahogany polish and the clink of crystal. A sea of tuxedos and silk gowns shifted under the glow of the massive chandeliers, creating sharp, jagged shadows against the marble floor. I felt the weight of 29 years of invisibility pressing down on me. Across the room, my father, Bundy, stood on the grand staircase. He looked every bit the patriarch, his chest puffed out as he toasted my brother. To Mendez, my father's voice boomed, echoing off the high ceilings. For his visionary leadership on the North Link project, he is the true architect of our family's future. My throat tightened. I was the one who had stayed up until 3 a.m. for 3 weeks straight, scrubbing the data and fixing the structural flaws in that project. Mendez hadn't even read the final brief. I took a deep breath, smoothing my dress. I remembered what my grandfather used to tell me. True nobility isn't about the blood in your veins, but the grace you carry when the world tries to diminish you. I chose to smile. It wasn't an act of weakness. It was a declaration of self-respect. A woman in a sequined gown brushed past me, nearly spilling her champagne. She looked me up and down, then thrust her empty glass toward me. More bubbly, dear, and tell the kitchen the shrimp is a bit cold. I didn't flinch. I took the glass, set it on a passing tray, and met her eyes with a calm, stoic dignity. I'll be sure to mention that to the catering manager, ma'am. Perhaps you should look for the staff in uniform next time. I watched her face flush as I walked away. Intelligence is a quiet weapon, and I had learned to keep mine razor sharp. The room suddenly fell silent. Bundy stepped toward a velvet-covered podium that had been moved to the center of the hall. A single legal document sat there, looking as cold and clinical as a death warrant. The jazz music faded into a muffled hum. Legacy is about hard choices, Bundy began, his eyes scanning the room, carefully avoiding mine. To ensure the Bundy name remains a titan in this industry, we are initiating a legacy restructuring. Effective immediately, the entire estate and all primary voting shares are being consolidated under Mendez. My heart skipped a beat, then began to throb in my ears. Bundy continued, his voice devoid of any fatherly warmth. Adelaide, we've decided it's best for all parties if you are legally removed from the family lineage and all associated trust funds. You are a talented woman, but the Bundy diadem only has room for one crown. The room seemed to tilt. I felt the gaze of 100 strangers pitying me, or worse, mocking me. Casey, my mother, detached herself from the crowd and approached me. She looked beautiful in her emerald dress, but her eyes were like chips of ice. She leaned in, her perfume, a scent I used to associate with comfort, now smelling like a funeral wreath. Family is a business, Adelaide, she whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. And every successful business eventually has to trim the dead weight. She didn't strike me with her hand. She did something far more devastating. She reached into her clutch, pulled out a check for $10,000, and slid it into the pocket of my coat with the dismissive flick of a finger. Take this as a tip for your years of service. Now please disappear quietly. Don't stain Mendez's golden hour with a scene. I looked down at the slip of paper, then back at the woman who gave me life. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I realized in that moment that forgiveness isn't about letting someone back into your life. It's a gift you give yourself so you don't have to carry their darkness anymore. But boundaries? Boundaries are what keep you from drowning. I turned and walked toward the exit. The handheld camera of the world seemed to follow my every step. As I reached the massive doors, Mendez stepped into my path. He leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive scotch. Don't look so surprised, Addie. You were always just a temporary placeholder until I was ready to take what's mine. I looked through him, not at him, but through him, as if he were a ghost that had already faded. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. Instead, I walked to the mahogany side table and placed the hand-knitted scarf on it. It was my final act of kindness, leaving behind the warmth they clearly lacked. The Houston downpour hit me like a physical blow as I stepped onto the driveway. I reached into my bag for my keys, but my phone buzzed first. A notification from the car's app. Access revoked by primary account holder. My bank app followed. Account frozen. I stood under the gatehouse, the rain turning the world into a gray blur. I looked back at the glowing windows of the mansion. The perfect child wasn't my brother. He was a weapon they had spent 30 years sharpening just to cut me out of my own life. I pulled out my phone, the screen flickering and wet. I didn't call a friend. I didn't call a lawyer. I dialed a number I had memorized a decade ago and never dared to use. The private line of Otis, my grandfather's old fixer. The man who knew where all the real bodies were buried. The cold rain of the gala night was a distant memory, replaced by the suffocating, humid weight of a Houston afternoon. 2 days had passed since I stood in that driveway, stripped of my car, my accounts, and my name. I walked through a small public park downtown, the air thick enough to taste like damp pavement. My silk evening gown was long gone, replaced by a navy blazer I had found in my emergency gym locker. Sharp, yet beginning to show the fray of 48 hours of wear. I stopped at a green metal trash can near the pond, my fingers hovering over the pocket that held the $10,000 check from my mother. I pulled the slip of paper out, staring at the elegant cursive of Casey Bundy's signature. It was the price of my silence, the price of my erasure. For a long second, I held it over the bin, ready to let the breeze take it. Survival whispered in one ear, pride roared in the other. But pride doesn't pay for a bus ticket, and survival doesn't win a war. I tucked it back into my pocket. I wasn't going to cash it, not yet, but I wasn't going to let them think they could buy me for the cost of a used sedan. The sting of being discarded still vibrated in my chest, a low-frequency hum that refused to settle. I had tried to check into a modest hotel near the medical district yesterday morning. The clerk behind the desk, a young man with tired eyes, had slid my card back across the counter with a look of practiced apology. I'm sorry, Miss Adelaide Bundy, but this card has been flagged for fraudulent activity by the primary account holder. I can't honor it. My father's reach was long, and he had spent decades perfecting the art of closing doors. I had spent my last $40 in cash on a bus fare to the outskirts and a few protein bars. Have you ever looked at your own name on a plastic card and realized it was nothing more than a permission slip that had been revoked? I found a bench under a sprawling oak tree, watching a homeless woman across the path sorting through a plastic bag. She looked up, her face etched with a kind of weary resilience I was only beginning to understand. I reached into my bag and pulled out my only sandwich, a dry turkey sub from the station, and walked over to hand her half. She nodded, a silent acknowledgement between two people who the city had stopped seeing. Poverty isn't just the absence of money, it's the systematic removal of hope. I refused to let my hope be liquidated. If the Bundy family wanted a ghost, I would give them one. But ghosts are notoriously difficult to kill. I spent the evening in the 24-hour public library. the scent of old paper and floor wax providing a sanctuary my home never did. I used a public terminal, my fingers flying across the keys as I navigated the Texas Secretary of State's business filings. I wasn't looking for sympathy. I was looking for a crack in the foundation. Bundy thought he had sealed my exit with a legacy restructuring, but every legal decree has a loophole, and my father's arrogance usually left a trail of crumbs. I didn't feel hatred for my mother, Casey, even then. Resentment is a poison you brew for your enemy, but end up drinking yourself. I didn't have time for poison. I had work to do. The next morning, I navigated the winding, sterile corridors of a secluded legal archive downtown. The air here was climate-controlled and smelled of dust and ozone. I followed a clerk toward a high-density filing shelf, the rhythmic thud of a heavy vault door closing somewhere in the depths, echoing like a gavel. My meeting with Otis was scheduled for noon. He was the only man my grandfather trusted, the iron-willed attorney who had spent 40 years keeping the family's darkest secrets from rotting. I sat in his clandestine office, surrounded by towering stacks of boxes. Otis looked at me over his spectacles, his gaze lingering on my wrinkled blazer and the dark circles under my eyes. He didn't offer me tea or platitudes. He simply sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering on a sidewalk. "You have your grandfather's steel spine, Adelaide," he muttered. "It's a shame your father only inherited the ambition." He slid a file across the desk, his expression turning grave. "Bundy didn't just fire you, Adelaide. He filed a non-compete and restitution agreement with the labor board. He's claiming you caused $5 million in trade secret damages during your tenure as his analyst. He's essentially blacklisted you from every manufacturing firm in North America." The air in the room seemed to vanish. I picked up the document, my eyes scanning the fine print. At the bottom was a digital signature, my signature, dated 3 years ago. I remembered that day. I had been in the hospital with a severe case of pneumonia, and Bundy had brought me a stack of medical leave forms to sign. He had tucked this agreement into the middle of the insurance paperwork. It was a premeditated trap, a paper cage designed to ensure I could never work for a rival or find the capital to stand on my own. I stared at the metadata printed on the side of the filing. I didn't break down. I didn't sob. Instead, I saw a timestamp. 11:45 p.m. Bundy had been sloppy. He had filed the document through a secondary server that bypassed the standard verification protocols. A cage is only a cage if you don't know where the lock is. My father's arrogance had made him think I wouldn't have the resources to even look at the paperwork, let alone understand the flaw in its filing. Otis stood up, walking toward a small, reinforced safe in the corner of the room. He returned with a physical key, brass, heavy and ornate. "This isn't to a house, Adelaide. It's to a safe deposit box your grandfather kept at the old Houston Commerce Bank. He moved it there shortly before he passed. Your father never knew it existed. He thought the old man's mind had gone soft, but he was just making sure the truth had a place to hide." I took the key, the cold metal biting into my palm. I looked at Otis and spoke with a voice that sounded older than my years. "I'm not going to seek revenge, Otis. Vengeance is messy. I just want the truth. Justice isn't about hurting the people who hurt you. It's about making sure the truth outlives the lie." We spent the next hour in the archives opening the box. Inside was a leather-bound ledger. My grandfather's handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, slanted, and precise. It wasn't a record of money. It was a record of biological inconsistencies. He had tracked Mendez's entry into the family with the suspicion of a man who knew his own blood. There were mentions of blood types that didn't match, dates that shifted in the family Bible, and a secret payment to a clinic in Switzerland. The slave contract my father had used to bind me was just the perimeter fence, the real hunt, the one that would determine who actually deserved the Bundy name, was only just beginning. Have you ever felt the sudden, terrifying thrill of realizing you're no longer the prey? I stepped out of the archive building as the sun began to dip behind the skyscrapers, casting long, bruised shadows over the street. I reached the edge of the sidewalk, waiting for a cab I couldn't afford, when I saw it. A black SUV, windows tinted to a void, idling at the corner. As I started to walk, it rolled forward, keeping pace with my stride. I stopped. It stopped. I watched the vehicle's headlights reflect in a dark puddle near the curb. The light shimmered, distorted and bright. I didn't run. I stood my ground, my fingers tightening around the brass key in my pocket. The perfect son was a shadow, my father was a paper tiger, and I had just found the ledger that would burn it all down. Standing there at the edge of the street, I realized my keys no longer fit the world I built, but I was finally learning how to pick the locks. The black SUV lingered at the corner of my vision, a silent vulture in the humid Houston dusk. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a backward glance. Instead, I retreated into the one place where I knew the shadows worked for me: the sterile, high-security corridors of the Harris County Medical Archives. 1 week had passed since the gala, and the initial shock had hardened into a cold, surgical precision. I moved through the fluorescent-lit hallways, my footsteps muffled by the linoleum, feeling like a ghost haunting my own history. I reached the terminal for the legacy records, the air here smelling of ozone and recycled breath. My hands, steady and encased in thin latex, hovered over the keyboard. Most people think digital security is a wall. I knew it was more like a spider web. I bypassed the standard login screens using a physical override code my grandfather had pressed into my hand years before he died. "Adelaide," he had whispered, his eyes clouded but urgent. "There are debts in this family that haven't been paid. Use this when the collectors come knocking." I understood now that a lie is a debt to the truth that must eventually be paid with interest. My family had been living on credit for 30 years. A rhythmic hum filled the small storage room as I began scanning the paper trails. Shadows stretched across the floor, mimicking the distortion of the truth I was about to unearth. As the documents flickered on the screen, a memory hit me, a flashback of Casey. She was standing in the nursery, her face as pale as the silk of her dress, looking at me not with love, but with a strange, shimmering fear. I used to think I was the cause of that fear. Now I realize I was just the witness to it. I paused when I encountered an old woman in the cafeteria later, a retired neonatal nurse named Mrs. Higgins. She looked at me, her eyes squinting through thick lenses. "You have the Bundy eyes," she rasped. "I remember your birth. It was a chaotic week. There was a special arrangement made for the other child born that same night. Your mother was very insistent on privacy." I felt a sudden, sharp pang of sorrow for Casey. Her cruelty wasn't born of strength, but of a desperate, clawing need to hide a shame she couldn't outrun. I whispered to the empty air, "I don't hate you for the lie, Mother. I pity you for the fear of it." I returned to the terminal, the intellectual triumph of my discovery shadowed by the weight of what it meant. I cross-referenced Bundy's archived medical history, records he thought had been purged, with the birth records Otis had helped me retrieve from the safe deposit box. The biological impossibility sat on the screen like a neon sign. Bundy has a rare O-negative blood type with specific markers that Mendez simply does not possess. It was a scientific absolute. Bundy cannot be Mendez's father. The deeper I dug, the uglier the replacement plot became. I found a scanned copy of a letter tucked into an old insurance file, written by a man named Julian, a former business rival Casey had been seen with decades ago. It wasn't a love letter, it was a transaction. Mendez was a pawn, a child used to secure Casey's status and silence a potential scandal after a secret affair threatened to topple the Bundy dynasty before it began. Family, I realized, is more than shared DNA. It is a covenant of trust. My parents had broken that covenant long before they ever broke my heart. I sat back, the cool moonlight of the Houston night beginning to bleed through the high, wired windows of the archive. I secured every digital file, every scanned letter, and every blood type chart into a triple encrypted cloud vault. No physical fire or corporate cleanup crew could reach the truth now. It was anchored in a place they didn't understand. The phone in my pocket vibrated. It was Otis. "Adelaide, Bundy's security team is tracking your phone's GPS. They're closing in on your location. You need to move." I remained calm, my pulse barely rising. Those who run from the truth are always faster than those who chase it. But the truth never gets tired. It just waits. I looked at the hand-knitted scarf still in my pocket, then at the shreds of the $10,000 check I had torn up that morning. It wasn't an act of anger, but a symbolic severance of the last thread. I was no longer the victim. I was orchestrating their punishment. I want to ask those witnessing this, have you ever uncovered a secret so significant that it changed the way you see yourself? A new notification popped up on my screen, an email from the family's private secretary, a formal invitation to a reconciliation dinner at a public restaurant tomorrow night. It was a wolf's whistle, a desperate attempt to bring me back into their orbit where they could control the damage. I smiled, a small, cold expression. They wanted me close. Fine. I needed to be close enough to Mendez to touch his glass. I needed one more piece of the puzzle, a direct, undeniable DNA sample. I am ready to walk into the den. The invitation was an olive branch wrapped in barbed wire, delivered with the kind of high society punctuality that had governed every miserable second of my upbringing. I didn't let the wet Houston heat wilt my resolve as I adjusted the lapels of my blazer. I had spent the afternoon studying the legal precedents of duress and unconscionable contracts at the public library, but no law book could prepare a person for the psychological theater of a dinner with the people who shared my blood but none of my soul. I wasn't just walking into a restaurant. I was stepping onto a witness stand where the judge and jury had already been paid off. I arrived 15 minutes early, a habit born of a childhood spent trying to be perfect enough to be noticed. The restaurant was an enclave of forced luxury, all amber lighting and velvet curtains designed to muffle the sounds of predatory deals. I took a seat in the foyer, my eyes scanning the exits, the staff, and finally, the corner table where the Bundy family crest was virtually etched into the air. I saw Mendez first. He was tapping his phone with a nervous, rhythmic twitch, his eyes darting toward the entrance. It was the frantic energy of a man holding a secret he didn't know how to protect. My mother, Casey, arrived like a queen in exile, her smile a masterpiece of cosmetic dentistry and practiced deceit. She reached out to touch my arm, a false display of maternal warmth that felt like dry parchment against my skin. "Adelaide, darling, you look like you've been through quite a trial," she cooed. I maintained a professional distance, my spine a line of cold steel. Toxic people don't change because you show them the light. They only shift when you refuse to be their mirror. I chose to hold the light myself. Bundy sat at the head of the table, the patriarch presiding over a funeral he hadn't realized was his own. He wasted no time. "I hear you're staying in a place that barely qualifies as an address, Adelaide," he said, his voice a low gravel. "It's a long fall from the estate, isn't it?" I responded with a grace that silenced the table. I knew my worth wasn't tied to a zip code or a trust fund, and that realization made me the most dangerous person in the room. I asked about the hydrangeas in my grandparents' garden instead, a small tether to the only love I had left. The background noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into a muffled hum as Bundy leaned in, the amber light catching the predatory glint in his eyes. The facade was gone. This wasn't a reconciliation, it was an execution. "We've decided to restructure the family's philanthropic commitments," he stated, sliding a heavy, cream-colored folder toward me. "That includes the specialized nursing facility where your grandparents reside. It's an enormous expense, one the company can no longer justify, especially given your recent lack of cooperation." The pressure in my chest felt like an iron band. They weren't just erasing me, they were using the only people I loved as leverage. Bundy revealed he had already initiated a withdrawal of sponsorship, a legal maneuver that would leave my grandparents without medical care within 72 hours. He slid a second document across the table, a voluntary waiver of all inheritance rights, present and future, in exchange for a guaranteed lifelong medical trust for my grandparents. This was a contract of adhesion, a document signed under such extreme pressure that it made a mockery of the law. I looked straight into my father's eyes, seeing the empty space hidden beneath his suit. "You think you're taking their medicine away, Bundy?" I said, my voice a whisper but echoing like an avalanche. But you're actually showing me how much medicine this family really needs. I remembered that the most powerful weapon against a bully isn't a fist. It's a mind that refuses to be bought, sold, or subjugated. I wouldn't sign. Not yet. I needed them to think I was cornered so they'd stop looking at my hands. The camera of my mind focused on Mendez's blazer pocket, where a tiny, unnatural red glow flickered beneath the fabric. He leaned in, his face contorted into a mask of fake sympathy. "Just take the deal, Addie. Why are you making this so hard? Tell us what you want. Is it the money? Do you want 5 million? 10? Just say the number and let's end this extortion of yours." He was fishing for a recorded admission, a way to paint me as a criminal to invalidate my standing in probate court. It was the Judas kiss, a betrayal meant to seal my fate. I didn't take the bait. I spoke with the surgical precision of a woman who had spent 5 years auditing the books Mendez had tried to cook. "I don't want your money, Mendez. I want transparency. I want the fulfillment of our grandfather's original intent for this legacy." I watched the frustration boil behind his eyes. He was playing a game of checkers against a woman who had already solved the puzzle. While he adjusted his hidden recorder, his sleeve brushed against a glass of red wine, splashing it across his linen napkin. He cursed under his breath, wiped the spill, and tossed the damp napkin onto the bread plate. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hand remained steady. I waited until the waiter approached to clear the appetizers, and under the cover of the shifting plates, I palmed the napkin. It was heavy, wet with wine, and saturated with the direct DNA sample I had risked everything to get. I tucked it into my blazer pocket, the fabric cool and damp against my leg. I had it. The undeniable truth was now in my possession. As I stood to leave, refusing the main course and the poison that came with it, my phone buzzed in my bag. A one-word text from Otis. "Breached." My breath caught in my throat. Bundy's fixers hadn't just been following me. They had broken into the temporary shelter Otis had provided. They were looking for the ledger. They were looking for me. The race to the lab had officially become a hunt, and the den I had walked into was now closing its doors. I stepped out of the artificial warmth of the restaurant into the chilly Houston night air. I felt the napkin in my pocket, a sharp key to the truth that would shatter the fabricated world they had built. Behind me, the headlights of a black SUV reflected in a dark puddle near the curb. I was no longer running away. I was moving toward the light, and I knew that once the truth was spoken, the darkness would have nowhere to hide. Sometimes, the person who saves you is the very person you were taught to forget. The Texas sky didn't just rain. It opened up like a jagged wound. Thunder shook the chassis of the old sedan Otis had provided, a rhythmic, violent vibration that mirrored the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I drove toward the safe house on the outskirts of Houston, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. Every flash of lightning revealed the world in stark silver flashes. The slick highway, the swaying pines, and the distant, predatory glare of headlights that seemed to follow my every turn. Safety, I had learned, was no longer a place where I could hide. It was a position I had to defend with everything I had left. I arrived at the apartment complex, but I didn't turn off the engine. I scanned the entrance, my eyes narrowing as I searched for the tiny, almost invisible signal Otis and I had discussed. There it was. The small piece of clear tape I'd placed over the door frame was gone, the wood slightly splintered. They were inside. Bundy's fixers hadn't just breached my space, they had tried to gut my refuge. I felt a wave of cold fury, followed by a hollow ache for Casey. A mother's love is supposed to be a lighthouse, a steady beam to guide you home, not a wrecking ball designed to flatten your existence. Yet, standing there in the downpour, I refused to let my heart turn to stone. I put the car in reverse, the tires splashing through deep puddles as I dialed Otis's encrypted line. We had prepared for this. I coordinated a diversion, a series of pings from my secondary devices that would lead Bundy's men toward the downtown archives, while I doubled back toward the private lab on the west side. In this hunt, being fast wasn't enough. You had to be invisible. I stared at the road ahead, the rain lashing the windshield, and whispered to the empty car. Adelaide, the truth is the only thing they can't take from you. The laboratory was a sanctuary of blue light and sterile surfaces, a sharp contrast to the chaotic storm raging outside. I stood before the monitors, my own reflection caught in the glass of a high-speed centrifuge as it spun Mendez's wine-soaked napkin into a liquid verdict. The hum of the machinery felt like a ticking clock. I watched the progress bar on the cloud server. 98%, 99%. The pressure was mounting. Mendez's hackers were already hammering at my firewall, a digital assault meant to wipe my footprint before the final upload could complete. I sat at the terminal, my fingers dancing across the keys as I deployed a honeypot server, a digital trap that would keep their IP addresses occupied while my data drifted into the safety of a federal cloud vault. Mendez didn't just want the inheritance, he wanted to delete me from the world to protect his own masquerade. Truth is like surgery. It's invasive and painful, but it's the only thing that cures. A lie is like a cancer. It feels comfortable until it's far too late. I looked at the young lab technician, who was trembling slightly under the intensity of the situation, and offered him a small, genuine smile. "Thank you for staying," I said softly. "How we treat those who can do nothing for us is the ultimate test of our character, especially when the world is burning around us." The silence in the room was broken only by the rhythmic sliding of a printer head. I walked toward the machine as the first page emerged, the ink still warm. The word verdict appeared in bold at the top of the sheet. My eyes moved down to the bottom line. 0.00% probability of paternity. I didn't feel a rush of joy. I didn't feel the need to celebrate. I felt a profound, heavy sense of absolute certainty. The report was the final nail. Mendez was an outsider, a cuckoo in a nest he never deserved, and I was the sole biological link to the Bundy name. I acted with the surgical precision I had practiced for years. I prepared 3 physical copies, sealing them in tamper-evident envelopes, and triggered the encrypted digital filing system for the Harris County Probate Court. Under Texas law, once this was in the automated queue, the chain of custody was irrevocable. I looked at the faded photograph of my grandfather I kept in my wallet. Honoring the dead isn't about maintaining their marble statues or keeping their portraits dusted. It's about upholding the values they lived for. I had kept my promise. Just as I tucked the envelopes into my bag, my phone buzzed with an urgent notification. The reading of the will had been moved up. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. They were trying to finalize the theft before I could even find a way through the courthouse doors. They thought they had cornered me in the dark, but they forgot that I've spent my whole life learning how to see through the shadows. I looked at Otis, who had just arrived at the lab, his face etched with the strain of the night. My voice was steady, a calm clarity that surprised even me. "Let them gather," I said, my gaze fixed on the storm outside the window. "I want every one of them in that room. I want them to see the light when it finally hits them." I shut the laptop lid, the glow of the screen lingering in my eyes like a promise. The final walk into the heart of the empire was no longer a dream. It was an appointment I intended to keep. The glass and steel skyscraper pierced the Houston skyline like a jagged needle, its 50th floor shrouded in a cold, clinical morning light that felt more like an interrogation than a dawn. I stood before the polished oak doors of the boardroom, feeling the hum of the city beneath my feet. Inside, the people who had spent 29 years convinced of my insignificance were gathered to finalize a theft they called a legacy. I checked the clasp on my grandfather's briefcase, the leather worn and comforting against my palm. I wasn't walking into a room. I was entering an arena. The heavy doors swung open with a muffled thud. The sweeping vista of the city was laid out behind Bundy, who sat at the head of the table like a king on a crumbling throne. A heavy fountain pen hovered over the final signature line of the will. Casey sat beside him, her smile a masterpiece of predatory satisfaction. Mendez was already leaning back, his chest puffed out as if the chair already belonged to him. The ticking of the wall clock was the only sound, a rhythmic countdown to a tragedy they had written for me. Bundy looked up, his eyes narrowing with pure contempt. "You're late to your own funeral, Adelaide," he said, his voice a dry gravel. But then, you always did have a flair for unnecessary drama. Sit down or leave, but don't interrupt the adults. I didn't sit. I walked to the head of the table, placing the briefcase down with a deliberate, echoing thud. Integrity is doing the right thing even when the world is offering you a fortune to do the wrong one. I had learned that the hard way, and today, the bill was finally due. Casey stood up, her face a mask of elegant fury. Security is already on their way, dear. You have no standing here. You've been erased. She reached for the intercom, but Otis stepped forward from the doorway. His presence was a silent thunderclap. He presented a court injunction, frozen in a silver legal folder. Under the Texas Probate Code, these proceedings are stayed for an immediate evidentiary review, Otis announced. His voice was steady, the sound of a man who had spent 40 years guarding the gates of justice. I looked at Mendez, whose smug expression was beginning to crack like cheap porcelain. He looked at me as if I were an ant he had forgotten to crush. Is this about the money, Addie? Give it up. You're pathetic. I met his gaze with a mix of pity and steel. I don't want the money, Mendez. I don't even want the title. I just want the seat to be occupied by someone who actually earned the name. I realized then that some people are so poor, all they have is their money. The room darkened as I tapped a command on my tablet. The massive 80-inch screen behind Bundy flickered to life, casting a cold, flickering blue glow over the shocked faces of my family. This was the moment of reckoning, the point where 30 years of shadows were forced to meet the sun. Instead of a legal argument, the screen displayed a video. My grandfather, sitting in his library, speaking directly to the camera about the true heir. His voice was a rasping ghost, but his words were a serrated blade. The video transitioned seamlessly into a live feed from the federal DNA database. The room went into a vacuum of silence. On the screen, two profiles appeared in high contrast. The red text beneath Mendez's photo flashed with a brutal finality. Paternity match, 0.00%. Beside it, my own profile appeared, the green text glowing like a beacon. Paternity match, 99.99%. The silence was deafening, a heavy weight that seemed to crush the air out of the room. The truth doesn't need to be shouted, it only needs to be revealed to be felt. Mendez's facade didn't just break, it shattered. He lunged for the tablet, his face contorted with a primal, desperate rage. This is a lie, she fabricated it, she's been sleeping with the lab techs. I didn't move an inch. I stood my ground, watching him unravel. Bundy's hand began to shake, the fountain pen dropping onto the white tablecloth, leaving a dark, jagged stain like a Rorschach blot. He turned toward Casey, his face a ghostly shade of gray. "Is it true?" he whispered. 30 years. And you gave me a stranger?" Casey didn't answer with words. She responded with a furious, defensive scream. She unleashed her hatred on me, her fingernails digging into the mahogany table. "You did this! You little brat, full of hatred and jealousy, who couldn't stand seeing your brother succeed." I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt only a quiet, empty sadness. "Father," I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria, "I'm not the one who caused this downfall. It was your lies that eroded the foundations of this family before I was born. I was just the one who turned the lights on." I pulled a final stack of documents from the briefcase, evidence of federal wire fraud and crypto scams that Mendez had been running using the family firm as a shell. I showed Bundy the debt load Mendez had secretly accumulated, proving that the perfect son had already bankrupted the empire he was about to inherit. The perfect child was a Trojan horse, and they had welcomed him in with open arms. The empire wasn't just falling, it was already a hollow shell, held together by nothing but vanity and ink. Bundy's face went from gray to a terrifying mottled purple. He reached for his chest, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The room descended into a chaotic panic, Casey screaming, Mendez trying to snatch the fraud documents, the lawyers whispering in frantic huddles. I didn't run. I didn't celebrate. I picked up the boardroom phone and dialed 911 with a steady hand. "He's still my father," I said to Otis, my voice a calm anchor in the storm. Send an ambulance to the 50th floor, now. As the air raid sirens began to waft from afar, bouncing off the glass skyscrapers of the city center, I stood atop the ruins of a dynasty. I had won, but there was no cheering. The hardest part of a victory like this wasn't the battle itself, but the long, silent journey through the ashes of those you once tried to love. 1 month had passed since the glass tower in downtown Houston witnessed the slow-motion car crash of the Bundy dynasty. The sterile scent of antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors were now fading echoes in my mind. I found myself sitting on the weathered cedar porch of my grandparents' country farmhouse, the air sweet with the scent of sun-warmed hay and blooming jasmine. The humid, heavy pressure of the city had been replaced by a light breeze that carried the sound of wind chimes. The fallout of the empire had been as brutal as it was inevitable. I had spent the previous week watching a digital montage of the wreckage. Auction signs hammered into the manicured lawn of the estate, the corporate logo being pried off the skyscraper like a scab. My last visit to Bundy and Casey took place in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment that smelled of stale coffee and unwashed laundry. I arrived to deliver the final court-mandated disclosures, but I stayed long enough to witness the total implosion of 2 people who had nothing left but their vanity. Bundy sat at a small kitchen table, his face a roadmap of broken capillaries and bitter regret. He wasn't looking at Casey, he was snarling at her, his voice a rasping blade. "You brought a stranger into my bed, Casey. You let me build a kingdom for a ghost." Casey didn't flinch. She leaned back and spat her words like venom. "You were always a fool, Bundy. You were so desperate for a perfect son, you couldn't see the one thing that was actually yours." It was a chilling look at how hate consumes itself when it no longer has a victim to feed on. The most expensive thing in the world is a life built on a lie, because eventually, the bill always comes due. Despite the poison they tried to inject into my childhood, I didn't leave them with nothing. I had established a modest fund for their basic living expenses, locked in a trust they could never touch or liquidate. I stood in the doorway of that small apartment, my voice calm and steady. "I'm not doing this because you deserve it, Adelaide's parents," I said, using the distance of third person to finalize the separation. "I'm doing it because I refuse to be the monster you tried to make me." Holding on to anger is like letting someone live rent-free in your head, and it was finally time for an eviction. I returned to my own office, a quiet, sunlit space that felt like a sanctuary. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, the screen reflecting a resolve I had never known I possessed. With a single, deliberate keystroke, I executed the final command Otis had helped me draft. On the secondary monitor, the servers of the old Bundy manufacturing firm began to go dark as my proprietary code was retracted. This was the withdrawal of life, the final act of reclaiming the intellectual property that had been the company's true heart. As the only mind that understood the complex ISO 9001 systems I had engineered, my departure made the firm an empty husk. Mendez called me from his jail cell just as the servers went quiet, his voice cracking with a desperation that no longer reached me. "Adelaide, please. The creditors are coming for the equipment. Just give me the access codes. I'll give you whatever you want." I listened to him breathe for a moment, then spoke with a clarity that cut through his noise. "The codes were never the secret, Mendez. The hard work was, and you never had that. The greatest revenge isn't to be like your enemy. It's to succeed so completely that they become irrelevant to your story." I signed the final incorporation papers for Adelaide Legacy Consulting, a firm dedicated to ethical restructuring for family businesses in crisis. I was reclaiming my name on my own terms, turning the trauma of my past into a tool for someone else's future. The legal battle was over, and the Bundy name was officially a footnote in a larger, better story. I closed the laptop, the silence of the office feeling not like an absence, but a presence. I walked back out onto the porch as the golden hour began to bathe the Texas countryside in a warm, amber glow. I watched my grandfather tending to his rose bushes, his movements slow, but full of a quiet, stubborn love. I realized then that true inheritance isn't found in a bank vault or a legal decree. It's found in the character of the people who raised you to be kind in a world that often rewards cruelty. I felt a vibration in my pocket, a text from Otis confirming that the probate court had finalized the transfer of the farmhouse to my name. I put the phone face down on the table, choosing the moment over the noise. I shared a sudden, bright moment of laughter with my grandmother as we sat together, the wind blowing through the ancient oaks. Life doesn't have to be perfect to be wonderful. It just has to be honest. I looked out at the horizon, where the sun was setting on the ruins of the old world and rising on a legacy that finally belonged to me. I had survived the erasure, endured the hunt, and found my way back to the truth.